Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives webinar assessing the Trudeau policy record and what might lie ahead in the context of an impending federal election and a new Trump presidency. I'm Amanda Klang, Senior Communications Specialist with the CCPA National Office and your host for today's webinar. I'm speaking to you from Tiohtià:ke, the Mohawk name for the island of Montreal. This is the western edge of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is one of the longest lasting participatory democracies in the world. We recognize these unceded territories here and across Turtle Island and the many settlers and Indigenous people upon it. We look to a better future than the present, and this is what guides our work today. We also know there's much more work to be done. First, a little housekeeping. We're so pleased to have so many of you here with us. Please give a shout out in the chat as to where you're joining us from. And know that you can ask questions via the Q&A module, and we'll get to as many as we can in written form. So, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced that he was stepping down as Liberal leader on January 6th, just over 2 weeks ago. The government remains in power, but all parliamentary activity, from existing bills to committee work, has stopped. And now the governing Liberal Party has much of its attention focused on the race for a new party leader and Prime Minister. The political uncertainty of this is compounded by a volatile moment in Canada. Yesterday, Donald Trump assumed the U.S. presidency with promises to impose crippling tariffs on all Canadian and Mexican imports. And so far, we're still holding our breath, though a February 1st implementation date has now been named. Trudeau's resignation also advances the timing of the next federal election, maybe to this spring. And so, with all of this as the backdrop to today's webinar, we're going to take stock of the Trudeau government's 9 years in power to assess its successes and failures of the paths it has chosen. We'll be talking to 3 researchers who each contributed a chapter to a new book on Justin Trudeau's years in power, edited by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. In the Trudeau Record, Promise v. Performance, 25 independent experts assess key issues in 6 policy areas: Indigenous rights, the environment and energy, taxes and spending, healthcare and social benefits, foreign policy, and social policy. The 3 chapter authors speaking with you today are Hayden King, Paula Moruto, and Marc Lee, and we'll drop their bios into the chat now. The book's 3 co-editors are also here in this webinar, and we'll be hearing from 2 of them today, and we'll drop their information into the chat now as well. And one important note before we get to it, CCPA is a nonpartisan think tank, so this will be a balanced and evidence-based assessment. And in case you think we're picking on Trudeau, we have published books assessing the Paul Martin and Stephen Harper governments as well. So let's begin with Catherine Scott, one of the book's co-editors. Catherine will give us some introductory remarks before we turn to our panelists.
Thank you, Amanda. I am so pleased to be here with all of you today, and we're thrilled that the timing has worked out perfectly for this particular webinar. We're thrilled that you were able to join us, and I'm particularly pleased to welcome through the 3 panelists here today, 3 of our 25 authors. Certainly this collection would not have come together without the work of these wonderful contributors. All of the editors, Stuart True, Laura McDonald, and I are eternally grateful. When Stu and Laura and I launched this project back in the winter of 2023, we couldn't have imagined the moment that we'd be in right now, talking about the legacy of the Trudeau government, certainly in the context of a pending economic crisis and rising national unity tensions. We certainly knew the government was in a precarious position. Prime Minister Trudeau's resignation, as Amanda noted this past month, almost certainly advances the timing for the next election. It remains to be seen whether his exit will be enough to right the Liberal ship, which of course is trailing, as we all know, quite significantly in the public opinion polls. The Trudeau government came into office promising a wholly different type of government from the combative reign of Stephen Harper. who is remembered as much for playing fast and loose with democratic rules and norms as he certainly is for his neoliberal economic policies and program of fiscal austerity. But it was the contrast that was so striking back in 2015, as we'll all remember, symbolically captured in Trudeau's Sunny Ways speech he delivered after his victory. The new government set a very high bar for itself. But no government, of course, delivers on every promise it makes to voters at election time, and unplanned events derailed the best of intentions. Certainly, the Trudeau government had its fair share of those, including a global pandemic, and as well the election of now 2 Trump administrations committed to upending the international rules-based order and long-term strategic economic alliances. But looking back on the Trudeau government's performance over these past 9 years, with the exception of some major policy wins, such as the Canada Child Benefit back in 2017, the 2021 Child Care Agreement, renewed investment in housing, and a concerted effort to reframe Crown relations with Indigenous peoples, this government has consistently overcommitted and underdelivered. The gap between promise and performance is in part, the result of implacable institutional and geopolitical constraints. But as many authors in our collection argue, it's also the result of freely made policy choices, freely made, that could not have hoped to have delivered on their stated goals. It's the disconnect then between stated policy goals and the policy outcomes that is a recurrent theme in many of the pieces we have in the collection. And it's certainly a factor, I think, in the declining fortunes of the Liberal Party today. We've seen an erosion in the public's trust that government can accomplish important collective goals, such as managing the transition to a carbon neutral economy or running critical public services such as healthcare or immigration. And I worry as well about our efforts to advance social justice goals such as gender equality or efforts to combat racism and ableism, which have attracted such a fierce backlash, as we saw graphically illustrated yesterday, and are being written off as either performative or a distraction from more weighty and important public policy concerns. Today, more than ever, we need to be focused on building communities where all can thrive. We need to stand against the politics of scarcity and fear. We need to advance policy alternatives that make a difference. Our authors identify important lessons that we hope will inform this crucial debate as we move forward in the months and the years ahead. And with those introductory remarks, I'm keen to hand it back to Amanda to hear from our first panelist, Marc Hayden King. Thank you.
Thanks. Sorry. Thanks, Catherine. And I just like to invite our viewers to type any questions you might have for Catherine Scott in the Q&A module, and we're going to be getting to as many of those as we can over the course of the webinar. That will be in written form. So now, as Catherine alluded to, we're going to hear about specific aspects of the Trudeau government policy, what it means for where Canada is going next, and that will be with our 3 chapter authors. First up, Hayden King. Hey, Hayden, thank you for being with us today. Your chapter is called Trudeau's Magic Headdress, The Illusion of Real Change Reconciliation. In it, you argue that Justin Trudeau oversaw the most active government on Indigenous issues since Confederation, but at the same time, the government's approach to Indigenous issues used a narrow, unthreatening interpretation of self-determination for Indigenous communities, especially where Indigenous self-government, issues of land restitution, and treaty obligations were concerned. So I want to unpack this with a couple of questions. First, what are some examples of the initially promising changes the Trudeau government pursued? And as a part 2, have there been any significant or enduring changes with respect to Indigenous issues?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, thank you for the question, and thank you for having me, and for the editors pulling this volume together. I'm happy to be a part of it. And I think it's useful to start by echoing what Catherine had said about the initial optimism and excitement about the first Trudeau government following, of course, the sort of cold and dark years of the Harper governments. And I think this is particularly this has affected Indigenous people maybe more than Canadians generally. I think being locked out of politics and policy for that decade really left a lot of Indigenous people, communities, governments struggling for alternatives through and around the really rigid policy and law that existed during those 10 years. And so when Trudeau started to campaign and was ultimately elected, he said things like the relationship with Indigenous people will be the most important relationship to me. And, no prime minister had ever said that before. And I think that the early indications of the Liberal government, the first Liberal government support for these concepts of reconciliation and the nation-to-nation relationship and that most important relationship were really striking. And I think a lot of Indigenous communities subscribe to those views. And I think, as Catherine said, it tracks with a lot of Canadians as well. There was that optimism. And I think the initial promises, in particular around things like free, prior, and informed consent or veto on unwelcome development, were especially exciting for Indigenous people. This concept of free, prior, and informed consent was emerging in the international discourse, and the Liberals and Justin Trudeau in particular went on Indigenous news media outlets and said, we're going to honor the decision that Indigenous communities make when there's unwelcome development in their territory. And I think there was also a move towards self-government through this proposed legislation, the Indigenous Rights Framework, which sought to sort of move communities out of and away from the Indian Act towards some sort of form of self-government. And of course, we know the state of Indigenous healthcare. The rates of chronic and infectious diseases far surpass Canadians, and there was a commitment to healthcare reform, criminal justice, the wildly disproportionate rates of incarceration for Indigenous peoples compared to Canadians. There was a commitment to address that, childcare. I mean, the gamut of social policy issues that matter to Indigenous people. Those were issues that Trudeau committed to addressing. And it was to such an extent that Trudeau would come to gatherings of Indigenous leadership and people would line up for selfies. And as I mentioned in the chapter, he was given a headdress, which actually is not that uncommon for prime ministers. But nonetheless, that excitement and that energy was real. And as we moved through the sort of Trudeau decade or near decade, I think we started to see some cracks in those relationships and a different vision of that nation to nation relationship. The gulf between what Indigenous people were expecting and what Trudeau was delivering was significant. All that being said, I think that there will be an enduring there will be enduring changes. I think during his tenure, the sort of the most important piece of legislation was the First Nation Child and Families legislation that sought to transfer jurisdiction over childcare to Indigenous communities. I think that was a really important piece of legislation, and it certainly was not perfect. There were many critics of that legislation, but ultimately it sort of created a foundation for how to talk about self-government moving forward that will endure beyond the Trudeau era. And I think maybe most importantly is just the change in the language, the change in the discourse. I think that the thing that Trudeau did that previous prime ministers hadn't done to the same extent was put reconciliation on the radar in a really big way, to the point that we were having these national conversations about it. And so I think a lot of Indigenous people were scrambling, trying to engage with all this attention, whether it was consultation or media requests, Canadians were talking about Indigenous issues in ways that they hadn't for a very long time. And I think we'll see if that endures, but I think we're in a different place when it comes to the discourse today than we were 9, 10 years ago.
Cool, thank you. You just talked about the enthusiasm, the optimism at Trudeau's arrival in power, and some of the initially positive things that he did. Yet in your chapter, you describe his government's approach to making change in the nation-to-nation relationship as more performative than transformative, ultimately. So how is that the case? And can you give some examples?
Yeah, I think initially Trudeau probably had some really strong advisors around him, helping to describe the relationship in terms that Indigenous people were likely to understand. You know, these concepts of land back and decolonization were being discussed within Indigenous communities, but at they began to circulate in policy circles, and I think kind of strangely to a lot of Indigenous observers. But the practical implementation or the interpretation of those concepts, or even if we want to interpret the nation-to-nation relationship or reconciliation, very generally, I think what Indigenous people had in mind was different from what Trudeau had in mind. Decolonization, for instance, meant creating a cabinet committee to review all of Canada's laws to sort of decolonize them. And that essentially died when Jody Wilson-Raybould was, left the party. And land back was interpreted as, well, let's just expand the boundaries of reserves. I think these are just sort of two modest examples of that gulf that I mentioned before between an Indigenous understanding of what the relationship ought to be and Trudeau's understanding of what the relationship ought to be. And I think it culminated in that rights framework legislation that I mentioned before, this really, I think, grand notion to transform the relationship wholesale. Really ultimately ended up being sort of tinkering around the edges and helping Indigenous communities become sort of junior partners in Confederation. Trudeau didn't do anything to address the relationship with provinces and territories, the broader relationship between Canadians and Indigenous people, those provinces and territories continuing to run roughshod over Indigenous rights. And I think land rights is another bigger example where, like I said, those concepts of consent were initially discussed, but then eventually pulled back. And really a potential tool to unlock self-government was consent. And I think that was a missed opportunity. And so we had these series of disappointments that, was referenced at the beginning of this webinar that I think was reflected in Indigenous policy as well.
Hayden, excuse me, Canada will be going to the polls this year, likely this spring. What for you is at stake for Indigenous communities? And you've touched on this a little bit already, but is there anything else you'd like to say about the Trudeau government's legacy, looking from this vantage point? And
Yeah, I think often we take a narrow view of Canadian politics, and this is not the first era of reconciliation. There's been multiple attempts by often previously Liberal governments where there was a clear recognition that there was something wrong in the relationship and an attempt to address it. Louis St. Laurent tried to do it. Pierre Trudeau tried to do it. Jean Chrétien, Paul Martin all tried to do it as well. And it's clear we're on the downslope of another of these eras of reconciliation. And I think that's unfortunate, but we've been here before as Indigenous people and communities. We're going down into the valley of reconciliation. And what's at stake is a hard question to answer because I don't think Indigenous people have historically or traditionally pegged their prospects or opportunities to political parties or to Canadian governments generally. They're going to continue to challenge in court. They're going to continue to challenge on the land. There will continue to be negotiation, and you know, it'll take different forms. Certainly, what Trudeau was effective at was creating new negotiation channels and new settlement pathways. And I think we'll see less of that moving forward, but it won't stop Indigenous people from continuing to push forward to create that vision of Indigenous life that has been long sought after and will continue to be for Indigenous communities today and our children and great grandchildren. So I think that there's a lot to say about the legacy, but it's really difficult to do that now. I think initially Trudeau will be remembered. These 9 years will be remembered, I think, well, actually, initially. But I think that there is also that sense, if it hasn't already manifested in communities, of betrayal, you know, of that opportunity that was lost, and that reemergence of skepticism and caution of Canadian governments and their goodwill or proposed goodwill. And I think that's why you have seen a little bit of a movement among Indigenous communities towards conservative views. I think that just like Canadians generally, that sentiment is growing among Indigenous communities, but you'll also see that movement back towards putting faith in our own communities and pushing for change on our own terms.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hayden. And to everyone else, use the Q&A module if you have any questions for Hayden King. Now I'd like to move on to speak with another chapter author, and that is Paula Moruto.
Hi, thank you for inviting me today.
Oh, great to have you here, Paula. Your chapter from the book is From Prohibition to Harm Reduction, Transforming Canada's Drug Policies. And it looks at the evolution of drug policy in Canada over the past decade, from an emphasis on drug prohibition and criminalization to a more progressive framework that emphasized harm reduction and treated drug use as a public health issue. Internationally, Trudeau gained recognition as a leading advocate for drug reform as he moved to legalize recreational cannabis and expand harm reduction facilities and supports. But at home, the policy has generated criticism from the left and the right. So I want to ask you, can you describe the evolution of Trudeau's drug policy, its strengths and shortcomings, and if and how it marked a significant departure from the past?
Okay, thank you for that question. So Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's drug policy, specifically the 2018 Cannabis Act, or Bill C-45, marked a critical paradigm shift in Canada. It was a bold move and a departure from the past punitive criminalization and Canada's war on drugs approach. So the Cannabis Act signaled a shift towards a progressive public health framework that prioritized harm reduction. This was a significant achievement. But the question we need to consider and evaluate is whether these policies truly delivered on their promises. In terms of its successes, internationally, the Cannabis Act placed Canada on the map as a leading advocate for drug reform. This wasn't just a policy change. It was also a recognition of the historical devastation that was wrought by prohibition and Canada's version of the war on drugs, a system that disproportionately targeted Black and Indigenous Canadians, saddling them with charges, and Indigenous people, saddling them with charges, prison time, community supervision, and criminal records that denied them access to jobs, housing, and dignity. Many Canadians were actively using recreational drugs. The number of pot shops that have developed over the years is evidence of this. Yet marginalized communities were being specifically targeted and criminalized for engagement in recreational drug use or for having an addiction, which finally the government acknowledged as a public health issue and not a criminal justice one. So this was a huge, significant shift. The Cannabis Act was also touted as an economic success. Between 2018 and 2021, in the first 2.5 years, it injected $43.5 billion into our GDP, creating nearly 100,000 jobs and generating billions in tax revenues. But the question is, for whom? This is the question that lingers, and this is where we see the shortcomings of the policy. The Cannabis Act offered an opportunity for the government to address the wrongs that were inflicted on communities most impacted by the war on drugs. It opened the door or possibility of creating meaningful reparations for Black and Indigenous people who bore the brunt of over-policing and criminalization. Yet none of the cannabis investments or economic prosperity were earmarked for these communities. 84% of cannabis business owners identify as white. That's 84%. Black and Indigenous representation was a mere 1% and 3%, respectively. Meanwhile, there were examples across the border in the United States, like in California and Illinois, which have legalized aspects of drug use, but they prioritized equity in their legislative frameworks. They allocated licenses and profits to those most affected by prohibition. In Massachusetts and Oakland, California, 50% of cannabis business licenses were allocated to what were called equity applicants who were arrested or convicted for cannabis-related crime or who lived in a historically over-policed neighborhood. And Illinois directed 25% of cannabis sales towards affected communities. So this was a moment where the Canadian government could have demonstrated progressive leadership, not just in legalizing cannabis, but in addressing the legacy of systemic racism related to policing and inequality. Yet the Trudeau government missed a critical opportunity to align drug reform with broader commitments to, in particular, reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and other affected communities. Given all the promises and pledges to address the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to establish this renewed relationship with Indigenous communities, this could have been a pivotal moment that the government could have used to demonstrate its commitment by reinvesting in communities most severely impacted by the war on drugs. But we failed. Trudeau's reforms, they were a significant paradigm shift. Yes, they were that, but they were incomplete. They stopped short of the transformative vision that we could have had and needed.
Thank you, Paula. I want to turn to the opioid crisis. That's another issue addressed in your chapter. Of course, the scale of the crisis has intensified, especially since the pandemic. And I want to ask you if Canada's current approach is up to the task of preventing deaths and protecting vulnerable communities, and why or why not you feel that's the case.
Okay. In 2015, the opioid crisis, we had a crisis, but it wasn't a major political issue. But the landscape was quickly changing. Since then, the opioid crisis has swept across Canada. It's claimed close to 50,000 lives. The numbers shot up during the pandemic, and they don't appear to be abating. In the first 6 months of 2024, there were some 3,500 opioid toxicity deaths, and that doesn't include the number of hospitalizations. So clearly, Canada's current approach is failing. It's failing to prevent deaths and protect our most vulnerable communities. From urban centers in Vancouver, Edmonton, Toronto, to rural and remote communities, there's been a surging crisis. In Ontario, where I live, cities such as Hamilton, Niagara, and Belleville have declared opioid-related states of emergency, not due to natural disasters, but states of emergency because opioid deaths are devastating their communities. Particularly hard hit are some Indigenous communities where colonial legacies and limited access to healthcare and limited addiction supports have exacerbated the crisis. Now, to its credit, the Trudeau government did implement some critical harm reduction measures. It made naloxone, a life-saving overdose reversal drug, widely available without a prescription. There were some acts that were introduced, such as the Good Samaritan Drug Overdose Act, which encourages people to call for emergency help without the fear of arrest. And there was a 3-year exemption in British Columbia, which was announced, which effectively decriminalized small amounts of illicit hard drugs. Supervised consumption sites that provide safer spaces for those battling addictions expanded through Bill C-37. And although currently some of these progressive opportunities are under pressure being reversed in some provinces. In the October 2024 budget, an emergency treatment fund was included, which allocates around $150 million over the next 3 years to municipalities and Indigenous communities to provide a rapid response to overdose crisis. So there were measures implemented, important measures. These measures, while significant, are a far cry from what's critically required. Many experts have called for a national public health emergency declaration, akin to how the United States responded. But Canada failed to act with similar urgency, and many fear that without such a declaration, we won't have the coordination across provinces and territories. It's largely been fragmented. So we don't have the coordination that's required to address this crisis. Canada's opioid crisis demands a paradigm shift, a move beyond incremental harm reduction measures towards comprehensive reforms that treat substance use as a health issue rather than a criminal one. Experts have called for the decriminalization of all drug possession and the introduction of safe, regulated drug supply to protect users from contaminated street drugs. And we have examples in Portugal where this has been done successfully. Moreover, we need to address the structural causes, the root causes. The root causes of the crisis that remain largely unaddressed: poverty, housing, insecurity, the lack of affordable mental health services continue to fuel substance use. So in essence, the Liberal plan amounted to half measures, allowing vulnerable populations such as youth, the homeless, minorities, Indigenous people to suffer the consequences of an inadequate response to the opioid crisis.
Well, you may have covered this, but in case you have a couple more things to say, is there anything you'd like to add about the legacy of the Trudeau government's drug policies?
Legacy. So the Trudeau government's drug policy legacy will likely be seen as a turning point, marked by bold steps like the cannabis legislation and harm reduction. But the boldness demonstrated with the legalization of cannabis in 2018 is noticeably absent in its approach to the opioid crisis and other substance-related challenges. And this lack of a bold national strategy to address the opioid crisis may ultimately define Trudeau's period as a missed opportunity to address one of the country's most pressing public health issues currently.
Okay, thank you very much, Paula. And for our listeners and viewers, you can use the Q&A module if you have any questions you'd like to direct to Paula Maruto. Now I'd like to move on to our final chapter author, and that is Marc Lee. Here's Marc.
Hello.
Hey, Marc. Marc, your chapter, Overpromising and Underdelivering, explores one of the Trudeau government's signature policies, the National Housing Strategy, which was announced back in 2017. So to begin with, can you briefly provide some context for the announcement and describe the strategy's planks, or the most important planks or programs?
Sure. I mean, I think the big picture context on this goes back to the early 1990s, when the then Liberal government essentially got the federal government out of the housing game. That's not to say that they're completely absent. There's so many areas where the federal government plays a difference in terms of regulating the financial sector and mortgages through organizations like CMHC and so forth. But in terms of building and supporting the construction of dedicated social or community housing, as it's now called. That exit was significant, and in the aftermath of that, we really didn't have a whole lot of action from federal and provincial governments towards building genuinely affordable housing for Canadians. Most of it got taken up by investor properties, the development of condos, and these are sort of that then got rented out to households in terms of rental stock. So when the Trudeau Liberals were elected in 2015, it took them a couple years, but they announced in the fall of 2017 the National Housing Strategy with a lot of fanfare, a lot of hype. Big headline numbers. Initially it was $40 billion, and then a few years later it became $70 billion, and then $80 billion. And if you look on the website now, it's listed at $115 billion over 10 years. But apart from actually talking about big headline numbers, the actual results on the ground have been much more modest. And that partly it's because those headline numbers were exaggerated. They assumed matching contributions from provinces and territories. Those numbers were spread over 10 years. But it sort of became kind of a classic example of the style of government of the Trudeau Liberals, which was to overpromise and underdeliver. We saw some important innovations. I mean, similar to the other two speakers, the idea of human rights language around housing that was brought into the National Housing Strategy Act when it was passed in 2019. But with no real justiciable remedies to enforce that. So it's a lot of talk, but there's no way of actually enforcing a right to language. So most of the action with the National Housing Strategy has been on how much new housing is it helping to support. And here what we've seen is that most of the money has gone towards loans, often lower interest loans than what the market was providing, rather than contributions or grants to specific initiatives. And as time went on, much of that ended up being in what's now called the Apartment Construction Loan Program. They had a different name for it before. And at least part of the problem here is that there are so many sub-programs and initiatives, all of which have housing or affordability somewhere in the title, but all of which are doing particularly different things. But much of the federal effort ended up being in providing low-interest loans to the private sector, some not-for-profits, but largely for-profits, with some very modest conditions to provide a certain percentage of units at below market rate. But for the most part, just getting a stimulus from the federal government towards more market rental construction. What most Canadians would think of as social housing, coming back to the cuts in the early 1990s, is now under what's called the Affordable Housing Fund, which is incredibly modest in terms of its actual ambitions. The current 10-year target is for 60,000 new homes to be constructed, again, over 10 years, and about which only about 40,000 have actually been launched in any kind of form. And then another 170,000 units that were sort of repaired or renovated. So, this is work that needed to be done. It's helpful, but it's not necessarily contributing to new dedicated affordable housing stock. In the early years, we did get regular data updates from the federal government, but in the last couple of years, we haven't really seen anything. So we don't really have any numbers to go on in terms of actual completions of housing after all of these years. And to some extent, the money that was allocated and has been allocated over multiple budgets is still rolling out, and the final results are to be determined. Final thoughts. There are a number of initiatives that came after the National Housing Strategy was originally announced to respond to the ongoing crisis that was not being addressed. So during COVID, we saw the onset of the Rapid Housing Initiative. And this was interesting because it actually provided money directly, in a lot of cases, like here in Vancouver, where I live, to buy up hotels to house people experiencing homelessness. And there's been 3 rounds of that. And arguably, it's been the most successful aspect of the national housing strategy, even though it wasn't part of the original deal. Also, in the past couple of years, we've seen 2 initiatives. One is a $4 billion Indigenous housing fund, which just got up and running last year. So we'll have to see how that goes. And then there's a new one called the Housing Accelerator Fund, which was the federal government trying to put money on the table to induce municipalities to approve more density in closer proximity to transit hubs and urban cores and that sort of thing.
So, Marc, despite all of these efforts and investments that you've just been describing, 7 years on from when the National Housing Strategy was announced, affordable housing is still out of reach for millions of Canadians. And so it seems to have had limited impact. You've discussed different details, but if you were to give us an overview, like what did the National Housing Strategy get right and where did it fall short? Is it partly too much emphasis on private market projects, not enough on non-market? How could you help us understand that?
Yeah, I think there are a couple areas of success that should be pointed out. One is that, as the NHS was starting to come into play, there were big concerns in the community housing sector. A lot of housing cooperatives and nonprofit housing providers that were facing financial stresses as the mortgages on their properties were coming up. So there was support provided through the NHS for that. It's not something the government themselves trumpeted in a big way, but it was an important piece. The government also brought in this Canada Housing Benefit, which is a cash supplement towards rent for it's I would argue very narrowly targeted to the very lowest income households. But I think, taking a step back, the overall problem with the National Housing Strategy is that it had too much of a market-oriented focus. In Canada, we have 96% of the housing is market housing, and only 4% is what we would call non-market housing, community housing, public housing, that sort of thing. If you go to countries in Europe or even in Asia, countries like Singapore, the role of the government in providing affordable housing is much, much higher. So a much larger share of units are going to be supported in that way. In a similar vein, like a lot of as I mentioned before, a lot of the subsidies were around low interest loans for private development. And I think at the same time, we saw that the Trudeau government failed to really crack down on the speculation in the housing market and the financialization of housing markets. So I think belatedly we did see a temporary ban on foreign ownership and some full taxation of profits from flipping housing, like of short-term sales. But these are all sort of, far too late in the game and reflect a government trying to gain traction on the issue that it had sort of owned up to that point. But the ongoing failures to deliver for Canadians just became too apparent by that point.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I've got one more question for you, Marc. Looking ahead, of course, we know there's going to be an election probably this spring, and the issue of housing is going to be hotly contested. Where is that policy debate right now, and what lessons should we take away from the Trudeau government's approach?
Yeah, I mean, in the CCPA's alternative federal budget for a few years now, we've recommended that the federal government take the lead in supporting 1 million new units of dedicated, affordable rental housing, sort of like old school social or community housing. And I think that is just the missing ingredient in all of this. We need to break out of the dominant market mindset. And if we just look at what's happening in the market right now, you can see some of the challenges with that approach. The period of higher interest rates that we've gone through over the last few years greatly increases the financing costs for private developers. Higher land and construction costs are also undermining a lot of market development. So, in places like Toronto, we're seeing this really severely, where the condo market has huge supply already, and that's coming on stream and undermining reducing the incentives for new private sector development. So I think what we're seeing in terms of the election, the Poilievre Conservatives are promising a GST cut on all new housing. The Trudeau Liberals already brought in that cut for purpose-built rental and for student residences. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not going to move the needle in a big way.
Okay. Thank you so much, Marc. And again, to our viewers, if you have a question for Marc Lee, you're very welcome to type it into the Q&A module. So to wrap things up now, I'm going to bring in a final contributor. This is Stuart True. He's one of the book's co-editors. And Stu, you have been preoccupied with President Trump's threats to slap high tariffs on all Canadian exports to the US and how Canada should respond. Of course, Trump restated that threat after his inauguration while signing a volley of executive orders. So how does having Trump back on the scene affect progressive politics in Canada? Big question.
Yeah. Thank you, Amanda. And thanks to the audience as well, and also the authors. I just wanted to say it was a pleasure to work with Hayden and Paula and Marc on the book, and I actually hope we can do it again sometime in maybe different circumstances. So coming, Amanda, to your question, I think preoccupied is definitely the word in talking about Trump and some of the concerns we have here at the CCPA. I expect these early days of the Trump presidency will suck a lot of air in Canada to the detriment of our ability to collectively address a lot of the many other problems in this country, some of which we've talked about today. Trump's rhetoric and recent actions, including these executive orders, are going to color the Liberal leadership contest. Obviously, they're going to contribute to national panic on how we respond to things like a possible 25% tariff or even the militarization of the northern border. This is something that kind of crept into the executive orders and something that Trump actually put on the agenda, if you remember, back in 2020. It's going to color provincial politics as well, notably a likely election in Ontario that could be called as early as Sunday or Monday. And of course, it's going to foment East-West divisions, which might actually be part of Trump's strategy here. Trump's return has and will continue to inflame national debates about immigration in Canada. It's possible he may ask Canada to cooperate with him on the mass removal of people from the US, for example. And again, the militarization of the border comes up as a question mark for me here. Trump's hateful executive orders on gender, on immigration, and on so-called merit-based hiring are not so much dog whistles, I would say, as they're kind of trumpets for white nationalists within the United States and beyond. He says he wants to usher in a new golden age. Of course, this is a golden age of conservatism for Trump, aimed at fighting what he calls wokeism, right, within government, and reinforcing so-called traditional values. This, in many respects, to me, actually harkens back to the Harper government's attacks against Muslims, Indigenous peoples, and environmentalists during his final years. The new right casts a wider net, intentionally drawing in groups of people they do not like into a vast woke conspiracy against their freedom and way of life. This agitation, I think, serves corporate interests. It serves anti-democratic interests. And I think combating the new right is vital, right, to any progressive politics in Canada in the coming time. At the same time, I just want to come back to Trump here. I've left Trump actually, but just to come back to these tariffs, right? These tariffs that he's threatening, I think are actually have a potential to unify Canada to some extent. And we're seeing this in terms of public attitudes, right? So polls show for the most part, we don't want to become Americans. Okay, no surprise there. But actually, we less want to become Americans than we did even like 5-10 years ago, according to some of these polls. They show that basically everyone in Canada is aware of these Trump threats, and they're more or less aware of the economic risks that they pose to the Canadian economy. And then you get people like Jim Basile, right, like the BlackBerry founder, saying things like, we're all economic nationalists now, by which he means, maybe we're going to stop thinking officially North-South trade relations of the utmost importance to Canada. We need to be thinking about how do we actually separate to some extent to insulate ourselves from these these shocks to the Canadian economy that come from changes in government in Washington and things like America First. So I won't go into detail on the tariff threat. Maybe there's some questions about that I'm happy to answer. Whether it's 25 or 10%, it's going to hit Canadian jobs very, very hard. And of course, we want to be prepared to retaliate in that event. But to your question, Amanda, about the next chapter, I suppose, I'll take a few parting shots. And in doing so, I want to draw on a chapter that Richard Nimogene from Carleton University wrote, also in our book on Canada-US relations. So first, for me, the path forward necessarily involves Indigenous settler solidarity. For example, well before Trump, we had the exploitation of natural resources was a major issue, right? Most of this happens on Indigenous lands, including petrochemicals, but also critical minerals used for renewable energy technologies, electric vehicles, and of course, increasingly these massive data centers that the corporate sector would like to be producing and powering, right? We need critical minerals for the power for all of these things as well. The way that material was being extracted and exploited produced the inspiring Idle No More movement of the post-financial crisis period in Canada under the Harper government. And I would say without the bridges between movements that were made during this time, there would have been no high-profile alternative currents for Trudeau, Prime Minister, for Justin Trudeau to tap into during that initial 2015 election race. Trudeau rode that optimism and the strength of the movement's demands for change to a huge majority mandate, which, as this webinar has discussed, the government may have ultimately did, I would say, squander, unfortunately, in too many cases. The second point on immigration and deportation, I think this is of immediate concern to us. Canada could and should look to Chicago and San Diego as examples of how to respond. So these are important sanctuary cities. Many people might be aware of this, where undocumented people can receive services and be treated with dignity, and where city officials refuse to cooperate with immigration and customs enforcement officers, the ICE, as they're called. There's going to be pressure on Canada to cooperate at the border or face continued tariffs, but there's only so much I think we should be prepared to agree to. And we need to draw the line at violating the rights, international legal protections and rights of migrants. Absolutely not. Finally, I'll come to this idea of us being economic nationalists now. I think what Trump does is underline the lie of a sustainable Canadian prosperity through trade with the United States. I think we need to be thinking about producing more of the goods we consume in Canada. We need to think about how to attract investment to Canada through quality public services. And yes, affordable public housing, as Marc was discussing, instead of through tax cuts and deregulation, which is the Trump route and obviously the route favored by Canada's business class. And we need to be thinking about how to trade and interact more with countries other than the United States. We should be taking a page, I think, out of Mexico's book here and looking to build electric cars through things like crown corporations. If Trump wants to back away from that agenda, which it looks like he does through these executive orders, I think we need to be plowing ahead with creative answers like that. If the private sector is not going to do it and Trump doesn't want to, maybe we can, and we can do it through our public resources. So in conclusion, the challenges we face are significant, but when have they not been, I suppose? The Trudeau government has made some progress in a number of areas, as we've heard today from Hayden, Marc, and Paula. But Trudeau's record in government also is one of compromise with corporate power, bias for market-based solutions, and baby steps on new social programs. So I think it's time to inspire again with a positive vision for Canada that can defeat the far right and set us on a more sustainable and independent path. So Amanda, I'll toss it over to you, and thanks again, everyone, for attending.
All right. With that rousing words, thank you, Stu, very much. And of course, if people want to ask any question directly to Stu on anything he's just said, you can put that in the Q&A module. So we are getting close to the end of today's webinar. But before we wrap up, I want to share a small story with you. The CCPA recently redid our website, and every post had to get moved over to a new tool called WordPress. There were over 9,000 posts dating back to 1999. And in the process of moving, some of the page links got broken. Nothing went missing, but when the links weren't working on the new website, the pages couldn't be seen. We've now fixed it. That was some effort. But we got an urgent message a few weeks ago from a professor at the University of Manitoba who uses CCPA research as part of her class assignments. Her students were under a deadline and they needed access to CCPA reports to finish their work. But with the broken links, some of those reports were not accessible. So we did get those links working again within minutes, but I wanted to tell you this because I want you to recognize that everything we produce is free to use for all, and that is only possible with individual donations. So if you'd like to support our work, please consider making a secure and tax-deductible donation via the link that is going to be put into the chat in just a moment. And as an added enticement, I will just let you know that any donation of $35 or more a year gets you 4 copies of the print edition of the Monitor delivered to your actual mailbox. So that's 4 a year with great illustrations like this one and, of course, fabulous content. So that is if you make a donation of $35 or more for the year. So I think this now brings us to final thank yous for me. We've already had some thank yous from our participants, but I do want to say thank you to the many people who had a part in making this webinar possible. To begin with, thank you to Lorimer, who published, it's the publisher of the Trudeau Record, Promise v. Performance. This is that very book, and I would love you to consider buying it. If you look in the chat in a moment, you're going to see a link for where you can find the book. You can also just go on the website of the publisher, Lorimer. Looks pretty good. Okay, so thank you to our 3 chapter authors who presented their research today, Hayden King, Paula Maruto, and Marc Lee. Thank you to the book's 3 editors who pulled it all together, Stuart True, who spoke, Laura McDonald, and Catherine Scott, who also spoke earlier today. And a big thank you to all of you for being here, for listening, for writing in questions, if you did. It's been really great to have you. And know that we have recorded this session, so you're going to receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording that you can listen back, and you can certainly share. We would love that. And that is it for us today. So I hope that you take care, and I wish you a wonderful afternoon.